In the Canadian wilderness, 12 adults and their children slowly disappeared from the world. Not geographically. Psychologically, Roch Theriault, called Moses by his followers, didn't use scripture to control them. He used hunger. He used cold. He used the slow removal of every skill that might allow someone to survive without him. Within 2 years, no one in the commune knew how to navigate alone. They had become completely dependent on a man who performed amateur surgeries without anesthesia, who assigned punishments that damaged bodies permanently, who reframed each act of cruelty as spiritual correction. This is what psychologists call learned helplessness, a state where escape stops feeling possible, even when the door is open. The Anthill kids weren't weak people. They were methodically stripped of the internal architecture that makes agency possible. By the time anyone understood what was happening, some had been there for over a decade. This was episode 14. In 1977, a small group of Seventh-day Adventists left Quebec and followed a charismatic man named Roch Thériault into the wilderness of Ontario. They were looking for purity, for community, for a life outside a world they believed was spiritually corrupt. What they found was something clinical psychology has a name for: a total institution. A closed environment where a single authority controls every dimension of daily life: food, sleep, labor, relationships, reproduction, and the interpretation of reality itself. Roch Theriault, who renamed himself Moses, built that institution from scratch. And he did it with remarkable methodical precision. The group's first years in the wilderness were genuinely communal. They built shelters, grew food, raised animals. The isolation was partly philosophical, a rejection of mainstream society, and partly practical. But isolation has a compounding effect that most people don't anticipate. Every month spent outside normal society is a month of atrophying social skills, diminishing employability, and growing dependency on the group for basic orientation. By the early 1980s, members of what had become known as the Anthill Kids had been in the wilderness for years. Their children knew no other world. Their skills were calibrated entirely for survival within the commune. Outside it, they were functionally helpless. Theriault didn't just isolate them geographically. He systematically dismantled whatever internal competencies might allow independent action. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a useful framework here. At the base, physiological needs: food, water, shelter, sleep. Theriault controlled all of these. He rationed food as punishment. He disrupted sleep. He determined who lived in adequate shelter and who didn't. When you control the bottom of someone's need hierarchy, you control everything above it: safety, belonging, esteem, the capacity to think about anything beyond immediate survival. This is not a medieval dynamic. It is a documented control pattern that appears across high-control groups with near-identical consistency. The violence in the Anthill Kids commune was not chaotic. That is the crucial clinical detail. It was structured. Punishments were assigned for specific infractions. They were witnessed by the group. They were framed as spiritual correction. necessary suffering to purge sin or weakness. This framing served multiple functions simultaneously. It gave the violence meaning within the group's belief system. It implicated witnesses who did not intervene, creating shared complicity, and it normalized escalation. Each act made the next slightly more thinkable. By the mid-1980s, Theriault had begun performing medical procedures on members without anesthesia, without training, and without sterile conditions. One member had a gangrenous arm amputated. Another had an intestinal perforation, sutured with a sewing needle after Theriault had performed an impromptu bowel operation. Several members died from injuries sustained during these procedures. The group interpreted these events through Theriault's framework: divine testing, spiritual purification, the price of belonging to those who were chosen. Former members have described the cognitive state required to accept this interpretation. It wasn't stupidity. It was the accumulated effect of years of dependency, sleep deprivation, hunger, and the absence of any alternative frame of reference. Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness, originally conducted with animals in the 1960s, documented something that applies directly here. When a subject repeatedly experiences painful stimuli with no ability to escape or control them, they stop trying to escape, even when escape becomes possible. They have learned, on a neurological level, that action is futile. Members of the Anthill Kids who attempted to leave were typically retrieved, punished, and returned. After several attempts, many stopped trying. Not because they wanted to stay, because their nervous systems had been conditioned to treat escape as impossible. In 1989, one member, Gabrielle Lavallee, escaped and walked to the nearest town with documented injuries from a procedure Theriault had performed. Police investigated. Theriault was arrested, convicted, and sentenced. He served time, was released, and committed further violence. He was ultimately murdered in prison in 2011 by a fellow inmate. Several former members remained with Theriault even after his first conviction. They followed him to a new location upon his release. That detail is not a footnote. It is the central finding. What the Anthill Kids case demonstrates is not that cult members are uniquely vulnerable. It demonstrates that given sufficient isolation, dependency, escalating commitment, and controlled information, the vast majority of people become susceptible to conditions they would have found unimaginable before entering them. This is not a fringe psychological position. It is consensus. The name Anthill Kids sounds almost whimsical. The reality was a remote Canadian wilderness settlement where adults were systematically reduced to a state of total dependency on a man whose need for control expressed itself in increasingly extreme and ultimately lethal ways. The mechanism wasn't supernatural. It wasn't unique. It was the same documented playbook that appears in closed systems across history. Control the basics, control the narrative, control the exits. Understanding the mechanism is the beginning of resistance to it. This was episode 14 of the Mind Control Archive.